one day, it was January, it was right around this time, it was inauguration day in 2005, I guess it would be, 2005. A story ran on the news. Basically, it was a front page in almost every major paper across the world, except for in this country, where it was George Bush being sworn into office. Every other country, instead of running pictures of George Bush, they ran pictures of a little girl. And it was a little girl, an Iraqi girl, and she was set against the black dark of night, but she was illuminated in this white dress that she had on with red all over it, and she was illuminated by a white light, flashlight coming off the barrel of an M16 automatic rifle being held by an American soldier. And the rifle was pointed directly at this 5 or 6 year old girl. And the girl was letting out, and I didn't hear it, but I could feel it, hear it through the image. The most blood-curdling scream I'd ever heard in my life. And the pain in her eyes was so tangible. Couldn't stop thinking about her and feeling for her. And as I read the caption and then the story that went with the news, I learned that this young girl, wearing a dress with red roses on it, had been sitting in a car traveling across the country with her parents on a trip, a road trip. Her younger brothers and sisters, or older brothers and sisters were with her. They came across, as all drivers on the highways in Iraq do, one of many American roadblocks. And for whatever reason, either because her father was tired, or because the radio was up too loud, maybe one of her brothers were fighting, or maybe she was crying, or maybe he didn't see it, maybe the soldiers weren't there, he didn't stop for the roadblock. And as he approached, did not continue to stop. Continued not to stop. The American soldiers did exactly as they'd been trained through many rigorous months of training to do. They shot at the oncoming car, killing instantly her father and mother in the front seat, and two of her siblings in the back seat. And she was left alone in the front seat. And so she was crying. And she wasn't covered just in a white dress with red roses, but she was covered also in blood, spattered all over her face, her dress, and her hands. It was the blood of her parents who had been killed in that car with her. And I couldn't help but cry. I was like moved to tears, and then rage and anger, because that is the image I will always have of this war, this campaign for freedom for the Iraqi people. And I wonder how free that young girl feels now. And I look at my own hands and I saw then and I see now how indelibly stained they are with her blood, her parents' blood of all 100,000 or more Iraqi people have died as a direct result of this current war since 2003 and the sanctions. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children died as a direct or indirect result of those sanctions. That urgency of what was happening in Iraq impelled me to look into going there and to eventually go as a delegate for 2 weeks to Iraq, to learn about what was the experience of the Iraqi people over the course of our occupation and war against them. And it was a really powerful, wonderful experience. I've never met a more, if we want to stereotype, I've never met a more generous, open people. The people that I met individually and personally were just had an outpouring of love for me and my fellow the people that I lived, fellow North Americans that I was with. I was with a group of 6 Americans and Canadians, and you know, we visited families and clerics, soldiers, government officials, civil servants, and people all across the country, and well, I should say in Baghdad and nearby in Karbala and Najaf, and tried to learn about what was happening, and try to support them in what ways we could, in so far as they were working towards, you know, peaceful nonviolence, and to be a, you know, and to learn as much as they could, or bring as many stories back here to people about. I don't know, when you guys think about Iraq, or when you think about what's happening there now, the context in which I was there was right before the run-up to the referendum on the Constitution. And so a lot of what we talked to people about were Constitution and how the election, how that would affect people, but also about detainees and the situation with the electricity and the oil and daily life, and you know, the whole gamut of things. I mean, I want to, you know, tell stories or talk about, you know what you guys are interested in, and what, you know, from the highest cleric, you know, almost the highest clerics in the country to, you know, homeless refugees, you know, forced out of their homes to flee, fleeing violence. So to Americans, you know, the other thing I should say is that I had in October of 2003, like in the first year of the war, I learned that a friend of mine from Cub Scouts when we were in like grade school had been killed outside of Fallujah by a roadside bomb when he was quote unquote serving in the U.S. Army as a sergeant. And I currently have like at least 3 or 4 friends who are stationed in or around Iraq. One close friend in Baghdad who I hoped to see there, but I didn't. He was on leave in the U.S. and I saw him the day I left in the U.S. But he's since gone back to Iraq. He's expecting to have like 3 or 4 more tours of duty, and he hasn't even finished his first. So, you know, I try to talk to him as well, and get a perspective of both sides, as people would say. But there's no such thing as both sides in Iraq. It's not black and white. It's very multi-dimensional sort of conflict, and different people and parties who have different goals and aims, and everybody, the normal everyday people are sort of caught in the middle of all of that turmoil. But even the people who use violent means are also suffering, both as a result of their own violence, but also as a result of the other violence that's perpetuated in that country.
Joe, I wanted to get your take on like interacting with people in Iraq. Like you'll hear a lot of people say that at least initially, in like through April of 2003, for example, there was on the part of people initial, for some initial sense of appreciation, some gladness that Saddam was gone, and that now that just in the same way that opinion polls in the U.S. have plummeted in terms of support for the war, that you would have found some of that. There would have been a number of people. Even I was just reading the other day that that some in the Iraqi church, some Christians there, were very supportive of what they saw as a liberation from the American troops. I mean, did you encounter? Talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Like, I don't think there's any statistical data out there in terms of how Iraqis felt about the American pending invasion and occupation over time, certainly at the beginning. There's no doubt though that like there was more popular support for it now, or that before than there is now. Like, I mean, there's anecdotally speaking, like I encountered very, very little support for the American occupation.
Okay,
Yeah, I heard that about Christians too. That before that, in the beginning, that Christians were pretty supportive. I can't imagine that many Christians continue to be. Well, see, some Christians I met were like kind of supportive, but the fact is, like for Christians in Iraq, like it's never been worse. It's hard to say like how many people now would support the occupation. I know there's been some polls by American polling companies about it, and like definitely less than 50%. But anecdotally speaking, like of the people I talked to, it can't be more than 1 in 15 or 20 people seem to be supportive of the American occupation. And I talked to dozens, if not over 100, hundreds of Iraqis in the short time that I was there. So, I don't think that there's not large support for the American presence, overwhelming support for the American presence there, because everyone is suffering from it, and like we heard reports about ethnic cleansing, that traditionally Shia neighborhoods, Sunni families were being forced out of their homes to relocate to other places, and the inverse in Sunni neighborhoods, that Shia families were being forced out, and there was little like concrete evidence for that sort of thing. But if you look at even in American cities, like demographic changes in our cities don't go well documented either. So it's hard to say when and where that's happening. The issues of kidnapping and torture and suicide bombings they're affecting everybody. There's hardly anybody probably in that country who hasn't had a family member who's been injured or killed as a result of what's happened in the last couple of years. And Christians now probably are half of what they were 10 years ago or 5 years ago.
Because Christians are leaving, right?
Christians are leaving often because a lot of them have family in Amman or Detroit or London, and so they'll go there. We met with the patriarch of Babylon or Baghdad. His doctor's here in Detroit, and he travels there regularly, and there's a huge Iraqi community there, and people are finding other places to live because as the country especially is continually divided between Sunni and Shia, in Arab and Kurd, Christians from Basra or Baghdad or wherever they may be from are realizing that there's not really necessarily going to be a place in civil society for them. And the new constitution, while it was promoted by our government and many people in the Iraqi government and Iraqi society, from what I read, and what at the time that I read it was the final version of the Constitution, which changed at least twice after I read it, even though it was the final version when I read it. It was really probably very divisive because certain subtleties of language of the Constitution lent itself towards being having a negative impact on women's rights group, women, and was not supported largely by women's rights organizations or human rights organizations, and it had a negative impact on other religious minorities, including Christians, Yazidis, Sabaeans who followed John the Baptist, and Sunni religious minorities. The language was very open for interpretation depending on how the government wanted to interpret it.
What's that one group called? Sabaeans?
Sabaeans.
And they follow John the Baptist?
They follow John the Baptist.
Is that a pretty big group over there?
No, it's relatively small. It's probably like, as far as like religious or ethnic groups go, it's probably less than 1%, maybe around 1% or something like that, I think. Refugees living in Karbala, in the Hotel Karbala, which had been a 4-star hotel before the United States and the Polish armies occupied the hotel. They basically like ransacked it and left it up in really poor repair. On the other hand, this was very fortunate because it was then open not as for business, but as a refuge for, you know, several dozen families who numbered over 100 people from Talafar to take place. And they fled there because it's the site of the mosque of the Imam Ali, the nephew of the Prophet, who is, you know, one of the most important saints in the Shia tradition, the Shia Muslim tradition. And so they fled there to the place of his martyrdom and his burial for his intercessions and his prayers to help them and their families survive. And so, you know, it was very fortunate that they had this place to go to, but there was, you know, probably no running water and jury-rigged electricity, and it was not meant for what it was being used for. We met with these people in a large room. I met with the men and with four or five other men, and we were hosted at this time by the Muslim Peacemaker Teams, which is a group that was inspired by Christian Peacemaker Teams, and began working in Karbala and Najaf to promote peace through nonviolence and resistance to the occupation through nonviolent means. And some of the stuff they've done is really inspiring. And they're a fledgling group, and they're led by an Iraqi American who returned to Iraq despite all the violence because of his passion for the people and his family members and his friend in his own country. Story about these refugees that I was meeting with. But that's a really good question. Like these, let me say, these refugees were living there, and they, you know, I had heard all about how the U.S. was bombing the heck out of Talafar, and I don't mean to belabor this story, but I heard how they were bombing the heck out of Talafar, and you know, we got there, and the refugees were really pissed, and I was kind of like off from the older men in the group. I was by far the youngest, and I was off a little bit because I had met this guy coming in the door. He's probably a few years older than me. Introduced myself, and I said, you know, hello, it's me, Yusuf, and he was like, oh my gosh, my name's Joe too, and we both ended up having the same name, and so we were talking, and he was, you know, he had been in law school, and these people were Turkmen, which means that they're of a Turkish ethnic group. They were probably Shia, although they didn't specifically state that at any point in time, and we didn't ask, because it's not necessarily always polite to do that, because mostly to them it doesn't matter whether you're Shia or Sunni. And so they're not Kurdish and they're not Arabs, but they're living, and so their native language is in Arabic. But he spoke to me in Arabic because he spoke it fluently, and some English because he knew a little bit, and I will understand a little bit Arabic. And we had this conversation on the sidelines with all these other young boys sitting around me, and at the same time as the older men were talking to the older men in our delegation, I was getting the same story about how their town had been overrun with insurgent, terrorist, you know, hooligan types of people who were kidnapping people, killing people, beheading people, committing all kinds of really terrible violations of human rights, and a lot of violent acts. It was unclear from what they said whether those people were foreigners or whether they were Iraqis. We heard both from, you know, different people. They were both foreigners or but they wore masks, and they especially were targeting Shia families and kidnapping people. And when the Iraqi army showed up to try and like secure the town and you know, fight off the insurgents, and not that I support the use of violence by the Iraqi army, but what happens next is sort of scandalous when we think about what, you know, we suppose the Americans are there for, because the Americans showed up and they stopped the Iraqi army, according to these people that we talked to, and they wouldn't let the Iraqi army fight off the insurgents, and that the you know, at one point in time, the Americans detained an insurgent, took away his gun, and immediately released him. At another point in time, there was an American tank outside of a place where these insurgents, and I use that term because it's commonly used in the media and in public talk, but it's a very nebulous term I agree with Donald Rumsfeld, it doesn't suit, what's actually happening there, but I also am not a big fan of his term, which is enemies to the legitimate government of Iraq. Because some of these people are freedom fighters or whatever. But anyways, they're running over our stores and stuff like that. And the American tank, they just sort of sit there, and the soldiers kind of let them do whatever they want. And they don't try and enforce any authority. They don't try and chase them off. They just more or less they allow and they assist them tacitly, if not actively, to ravage the city. And in the time after that, people who had gone to Baghdad, community leaders who had gone to Baghdad to try and broker a peace deal, were murdered upon their return to Tel Afar. And the U.S. Certainly had no control of the city, although they continued to bomb at night, bomb the hell out of the city. And I don't know what the condition is now, how many people have returned there, but it's a really bad condition. And they kept asking us, why? Why would the Americans allow the insurgents? Why would they allow them to do this to us? Why would they? What are they doing? I thought they were here to help us, and why? And all we could say is, we don't know. I'm sorry, we don't understand it either. It doesn't make sense, even to us. We thought they're over here doing a lot of bad things, but this sort of bad thing that they're doing didn't really make sense to us. And our friend and translator, explained to us later. He said, "Well, I'm no expert, but as I remember, you don't kill the goose that laid a golden egg." And so then the question was, what's a golden egg? And that became more clear after talking to another friend of ours who's also a translator, and him explained to us his experience of being detained in an American prison. And he deserted. He was captured. By the American army, or maybe he deserted. I don't remember. The Iraqi army, and then began working for the Americans as a translator, a medical translator, translating for doctors and patients in American military hospitals. And then after several months on the job, maybe 2 or 3 months on the job, he came in one day and he was told that he should not come back. He was being fired. And he didn't quite understand why, but he didn't go back. 20 days later, they called him back to work. They said, "Yeah, there seems to be some confusion. You're under arrest. We think you're a spy." They interrogated him. They said, "Oh, well, you're probably not a spy, but you still have to be detained. So we'll put you in this jail. You'll probably be released soon." He was originally put in the jail at the Baghdad airport, where Saddam Hussein is currently being detained, held captive. And then he was transferred to Camp Buka in the south near Basra, to Abu Ghraib, back and forth for about a year, each time being told he was about to be released. And eventually he learned better than to believe the Americans. And then through the Red Cross and the Christian Peacemaker teams, they were able to contact his family and let them know about his whereabouts. And he was, with their assistance, really released within that time and became a translator. But he talked about his experience there and said routinely when Americans would capture people who were fighting, in armed conflict against them with weapons and, basically getting caught red-handed with a gun in hand, they would routinely be released usually within 10 days to 2 weeks' time. And that if you were like him, though, and you didn't commit any crime and you didn't confess to any crime, you would be held indefinitely for months or years at a time. That also was really bizarre because you think Americans are supposed to be holding only people who are criminals, and they're not supposed to be holding people who aren't criminals, and they're probably just holding a lot of people because they don't really know anything, and whatever, they're making all kinds of mistakes. But this is really kind of different, that they're deliberately releasing people that they know are combatants, and they're not releasing anyone who seems not to have any evidence against them, and they're not even charging those people. And then he said, he told us about a story that was in the news when we were there, and that was that This guy, young guy, probably in his 20s, had been arrested, or even a teenager, been arrested with a bomb strapped to his chest. He tried to blow himself up in a suicide bombing, and the bomb failed. He also was released. He was arrested by American authorities and released 20 days later because the Americans said, announced on Iraqi TV that there was not enough evidence to charge him with any crime. And I don't believe in the justice system in courts and stuff like that, but it seems hard to me to believe that people who do could imagine that someone with a bomb strapped to their chest wasn't committing any crime and would release him to do the same thing. And so what the golden goose was became much more clear in light of those stories, that what the Americans want or are creating there is not just an environment in which they can readily control and use Iraqi's petroleum resources, but a situation of terror and violence and instability that will perpetuate their rationale for remaining in the country. As long as there is violence in the country, American occupation has to continue in order to stop the violence. And as long as the Americans are doing things that are going to cause violence, more violence will continue. And as long as they're allowing insurgents to come in across the border into Iraq, to terrorize Iraqi cities, and to further fragment and polarize the society between Shia and Sunni, encouraging Sunni, who are in the worldwide majority in terms of Muslims by far, but in Iraq are in the smaller minority of Muslims, maybe 40% out of over 90% Muslims, they probably make up about 40-45% of those within the country. Maybe about 40%, 60% are Shia Muslim. So the U.S. is created this honeypot where international terrorists or people who want to be mujahideen, fighting the evil empire, instead of going to New York to fly planes into buildings, or Los Angeles or Seattle or wherever they want to go, they're going to go to Iraq because it's closer, it's cheaper, and that's where the U.S. Army is, and they're going to target the U.S. Army rather than U.S. civilians. And so the war on terror isn't some farce, that I thought was just this cover for, oil and resource domination. It's a real deal, and the U.S. is fighting it on a foreign soil because then the victims aren't Americans or Iraqis, and these few noble heroes that volunteer to go and save our country and our civilization.